Hello, ngHouston. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm excited because we have Cory. Cory is awesome. So first I want to say hello to the panelists. We have one panelist, Lance. You and I are the panelists the last couple of weeks. That's cool. Yep. How are you doing?
Doing okay. Yeah, fall is definitely coming to St. Louis, so this is pretty good.
Right? Is it raining there? It's raining here in Houston.
It rained a lot this morning, like in the middle of the night, but no, it's pretty dry now. But it's cooling off.
Where's your cat?
I don't know.
No cats in the room?
Later, but she's hiding right now.
All right. And say hello to Cory. Cory, I like this is your basement, right?
Yeah, kind of temporary office currently.
I like it. I like the foosball table in the background.
Yep.
Okay, so I have been bugging you for a while to come on just because I think you're cool, and then you wrote this book, so I ran out and grabbed a copy of it and had a really good excuse to have you on, so you can teach us something from your new book.
Yeah. Well, I guess I can go ahead and get started, share my screen.
Do it.
Okay. Is that coming through?
It is.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so the focus of this kind of whole spiel presentation is kind of a beginner's intro to web components. So a little bit of background. I'm a GDE for Angular and Web. I'm a front-end developer for a small company in St. Louis called Vintage Software. And I'm also an Angular Bootcamp instructor along with Lance. So you can find me on Twitter and my website. So web components.
If Lance mocks you mercilessly, it's only because you guys know each other.
Yeah, Lance asks as many questions as you want.
Yeah,
so not that Lance would heckle anyone.
Questions.
we sat next to each other at a meetup last week, and we taught a class together last month. So yeah, we know each other.
So if we heckle Cory, it comes from a place of love. We promise.
That's something to call it. Sure, let's go with love.
Well, next time Lance presents, and I can heckle him, so it evens out. So web components is kind of a topic that I've been trying to deep dive for the past several months. Pretty excited about it. So kind of a high level web components. It's really a collection of several different web APIs. Kind of when I first started, I thought it was like this one new shiny web API. It's actually several different things. This is kind of a list of just a handful of them. But once you take all these kind of low-level APIs and put them together, you can actually make this kind of compelling use case for making components just natively in the browser. So components very similar to Angular components or React or Vue.js. So why you would want to adopt web components in your application versus, say, writing Angular components or Vue.js components? There's several reasons. The first one is performance. If you're using features that are built into the browser, it's just by default going to be significantly faster. Because these features are built in, we don't have to add additional code down to the wire to browsers. We can just use what's already there, so we get a really, really fast, lightweight component. The big one that I think a lot of people think of when you mention web components is encapsulation, CSS encapsulation specifically. So coming from kind of the Angular world, we have CSS encapsulation for our Angular components. So we can write some CSS for a component and not worry about that CSS accidentally kind of overriding and messing up some other styles in our application. And Angular kind of provides this as part of the framework. With web components, we can use the Shadow DOM API, which we'll actually see in a few steps. And that actually adds this encapsulation functionality natively in the browser. So it's a really good performance gain, and we don't have to rely on a framework to get this feature. Also with web components, kind of using all these features together, we get that similar component model that we see in Angular and the other frameworks. So an Angular component, we have some TypeScript, a template, and some CSS. Kind of like those three things glued together makes a component. We can get the same similar type of behavior with web components. We can have encapsulated CSS, a template, and attach behavior with JavaScript. The big reason a lot of people get excited about web components, and this is the main reason I really kind of deep dived into web components, is the idea of reusability. So the promise of web components is to be able to write UI components that work anywhere and everywhere. So you can write a component and use it in your Angular app or your Vue.js app. And even server-side frameworks and libraries. So if you use Ruby on Rails or .NET, you can just drop a web component in there and it just works with vanilla HTML and JavaScript. So you have a lot of flexibility. And this is a huge win for large companies that have several teams with several projects that might span across several different technologies. You don't want to have to rewrite a date picker or drop-down widget, for every single framework, for every single project you have in your company. You want to do that once and be able to reuse that code. So that's kind of the promise of web components. For the most part, web components work everywhere for all the modern JavaScript frameworks. You can kind of see I put a sort of in parentheses behind React. If you go to the website, customelementseverywhere.com, this is a really cool website. It actually runs kind of a end-to-end test suite against all of the different JavaScript frameworks. And it will check to see how compatible they are with web components. So Angular was designed to work with web components, so it has a perfect score. And actually just recently, in the latest version of AngularJS, they added full web component support as well. There's a lot of different frameworks in here, most of them 90 to 100% coverage. The one outlier is React, and they do list the issues opened against up against the repo, what would need to be fixed to get full compatibility support. So it's a work in progress. If you want to use something like React and web components, another option is you can use Preact, which is kind of a lighter weight version of React, and it has a little bit better compatibility with web components. So browser support currently with web components is getting pretty good. The next version of Firefox, which I believe comes out in the next week or two, version 63 lands custom elements support. So this is kind of the minimum API you need to really use web components. The custom elements API is what lets you create your own custom element tags in your application. So we're landing Firefox support. We've had Chrome for a while. Safari has custom element web component support, but there's one kind of edge case. You can see in the can I use, it's not quite green. With custom elements, you can actually extend existing HTML elements. So for example, say the button element, you can actually extend the button element and add additional behavior on top of that with custom elements and web components. That's the part Safari doesn't quite yet support, but you can still define your own custom element tags. So once Firefox lands, really that leaves Edge and IE left for web component support. Edge currently is working on it. They are actively working on all those different APIs we saw in that first slide. So hopefully in the near future, we'll have full support. And then poor IE is kind of left in the dust. So we can get full web component support with all the way down to IE using some additional polyfills.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that IE doesn't support it, but I am surprised about Edge.
Yeah, so Edge, kind of going back to that collection of APIs, Edge supports some of those APIs. I believe they just shipped Shadow DOM or are about to, so that would be one of the APIs you would need. But that custom elements one is kind of like the basic API that you need to really get started to build out web components. So yeah, I was kind of surprised about that too. They have an issue tracker that shows like priority, what features they're working on. and the web component APIs are kind of at the top of the list. So hopefully they'll be soon.
My favorite, you guys.
I've got plenty of projects you could help me work with because I have a lot of IE support to manage.
I don't see Mosaic on this. How is supported Mosaic? Just kidding.
Netscape Navigator? Anyone?
Yeah.
When I was a kid, we had to walk uphill. Hey, did you see that in the comments that Iron Teddy Bear wants to know if we can have examples in Vanilla.js? I was thinking you probably would have examples, or at least that would apply to all the React Vue Angular people.
Yeah, so
see,
that's actually
so
the next step. Yeah, code demo. So all the code I'm about to show is vanilla JavaScript and is vanilla web component APIs. So I'm going to show how you can write your own web component without using any tools, just vanilla JavaScript. And then after that, I'll show how you can actually use that in a Angular and a Vue.js app. So we'll see.
This is awesome. What about React? No React? No love for the React?
React's a little bit more tricky. So I went with the easier of the three. So
if you are a React developer and you know how to do React, then you'll be able to apply this and just stick it into whatever you're doing, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of there's a lot of content online about how to integrate web components with React. There's like a couple options and workarounds. So there's a lot of material out there, but I was trying to kind of condense it for this presentation.
I got you. All right. Well, Iron Teddy Bear can follow along, I'm sure.
Okay, so let me go ahead and pull up some code and just yell at me if this is not big enough of a font.
I think that'll be okay.
Text look okay? Pretty good size?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we'll see how far we get based on time. So what we're going to do is walk through how to create a drop-down component with just vanilla JavaScript. So it's going to have like a simple button. You click it, expands out and shows some kind of dynamic content. And a drop-down component actually works out pretty well. It shows several different APIs you need, web component APIs, to be able to build that out. So you can see on the left here, I've got about 8 steps. We'll see how far we get. Each of these steps, I've got a really simple index file. And in the index file on line 14, I have this X dropdown. So this is my custom element that I've created. Now, with custom elements, you have to have at least one dash in the tag name, very similar to Angular's rules with its components. That's mainly a way to work around naming collisions. So HTML is a language. If you've noticed, all the elements are like kind of single words. In the spec, they say we won't ever use a dash. The dash is reserved for your own custom elements. That way, if you create your own custom dropdown and they add a new HTML dropdown element, you don't have that naming collision potential in the future. So as long as you have one dash, you'll be safe from that. So each one of these steps, this HTML file is going to look pretty much the same. I've got a single script tag that's going to load in some JavaScript. It has this type module here. We're going to use kind of all the shiny new ES 2015 modules. So there's no like TypeScript or Babel or anything like this. This is just vanilla JavaScript. Okay, so in the index file, nothing going on here just yet. I'm importing my web component that I'll show in a minute. And then I'll come back to this. We'll play around with the element. You can select an element just like any other native DOM element. So we're just selecting it, and we'll kind of mess with this in a little bit. So the dropdown. Each one of these steps we're going to kind of slowly add on to the dropdown component, kind of feature by feature, make it a little bit more robust. So this is kind of the bare minimum example to make a web component. So to make a web component or a custom element, you extend the HTML element class and you register that class. So using the custom elements API, you define your element. So your first parameter is the name of the tag that you want to use and refer into the DOM. And then the second parameter is the actual class that you extended off the HTML element. Now with custom elements, they work very similar to like an Angular component or any of the other component models. So they have lifecycle lifecycle methods built in. So this first lifecycle method, connected callback, is called whenever the element has been inserted into the DOM. So we're using this lifecycle hook to set the inner HTML of our custom element once it's been attached to the DOM, because we need to wait.
So Cory, that connected callback has to be called connected callback. That's not something that you came up with, right?
Correct. That's the actual like low-level API that the browser provides.
Gotcha.
It's, I guess you could say it's cool. This is probably a little bit of a stretch, but maybe closely equivalent to ng on init, kind of.
Right. Right.
Kind of like an initialization callback or lifecycle method.
I'm with you.
Let's see. Let me get to the running example here. So this is our running component. If we inspect here, we can see there's our tag and the inner HTML set. That's basically it for the custom element API, kind of minimum footprint. So the second step is going to introduce another API called the template API. So the template API is a standalone API. You can use it without using web components. And the template API allows you to create a kind of inert or neutral piece of HTML that you need to use later. So kind of pre-Angular days, there was a lot of JavaScript templating libraries, like kind of like mustache handlebars type libraries. And they would do weird tricks like insert a script tag into the DOM that set the type to something other than JavaScript. That way you could have some HTML, but it wouldn't render. So the browser actually has this kind of support natively. You can create a template tag and add some content in there, and it won't render or do anything with it. So you can kind of hold on to some DOM and reuse it later. So for web components, we can use this template API for kind of a performance gain. We can create a chunk of DOM in memory and then reuse that piece of DOM over and over again every time we create a new instance of our component. So to create a template, we do document.create element, template, and then we set the template's inner HTML. Now on the component, we want to attach this template to the actual custom element. So this is going to introduce the shadow DOM API. Now we won't go into the features of the shadow DOM API just yet, but this is how you would create a shadow DOM. So the shadow DOM is the main API that's going to be responsible for giving you that encapsulation feature. So to create a shadow DOM, we're going to create a property, this .root. So root being the shadow root or kind of the root of your shadow DOM subtree. And then this attached shadow instantiates the shadow DOM for your given component. There's a couple of options you can pass into your shadow DOM. There's mode, open, and closed. More than likely, you'll use open. When you use closed, that kind of closes off the shadow DOM from ever being able to be manipulated. There's going to be use cases we'll see in a little bit where you want to be able to kind of override some of the encapsulation. So typically we'll have this mode open. And then on our shadow root, we just append our template. So we do root.append child, and then we make a copy of our template that we created. So this is just going to attach a new copy to that particular element. Now, if you kind of look at this, it looks a little ugly. The big thing to remember is these APIs were kind of designed to be unopinionated and kind of lower level. The goal of majority of these APIs was to make these low-level tools that other frameworks and libraries could take advantage of.
Okay, but hold on. Iron Teddy Bear and I both want to know, where did you get the custom elements? Is it just available? How did you You didn't import it. You just used it like magic.
This one here on line 14?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a global that's available on the window object.
All right. If you know that.
I've seen a couple talks on web components that go in the other direction, showing how to create web components from Angular. And I always get tripped up because we get to the point in the app module where they're doing this and there's a reference to custom elements, and I'm always looking around trying to figure out where was it imported from and all that. I just have to learn that, okay, that's there. Maybe if we said window.custom elements, it would be more clear, but then again, we don't do window.console log, so maybe I just have to get used to it.
Yeah.
Once you know it's there, it's
might be a good example.
Yeah. Well, now we know.
Okay, let me pull up the running example for this one here. So the output is the same, but if we inspect the DOM here, we can see in the browser we have that shadow root available. So it's not doing anything interesting. We don't have any CSS or encapsulation, but we've created a shadow DOM for our given component. So now we're going to be able to access some of these shadow DOM APIs.
I love the shadow DOM because it sounds like a comic book villain.
Yeah, it gets a little interesting when you talk about shadow DOM. So for example, when you get to CSS encapsulation, there's cases where you want to be able to override the CSS of a component that's using shadow DOM. So like the terminology I've heard people say or online is you want to pierce the shadow DOM.
Yes.
So now it's just, it sounds like you're just, yeah, it sounds like you're like an evil villain, like doing something bad.
I love it.
Okay, so now that we've created a custom element and it has a shadow DOM, now we can kind of start adding functionality. So our next step, quite a bit more code. The main API that we're introducing for this step 3 is the content slot API. So this would be very similar to ngContent in Angular. So it lets you put some content in between your component tags and then dynamically render that somewhere else in your component template. Same API, but this content slot API is actually built into the browser. Now the content slot API, to be able to use it, you have to use the shadow DOM. So that's why we went ahead and created our shadow root for our component. That way we could use this slot API. So our template's changed a little bit. We've added our button for our dropdown that's going to toggle our content. We have a div here. We'll use that as kind of a hook to show and hide the div or the content. And then the slot element. So this is going to tell the browser whatever content's between those tags, I want you to render it in between this div. So down in our component, now we just add the logic to handle the behavior of what we're trying to accomplish. So I have a property here, this.show. So by default, I'm going to hide the content. I create my shadow root just like the prior step. And then this is where I have to start interacting with the DOM directly. So this is where web components can get a little bit verbose if you're writing vanilla web components. So with vanilla web components, you still have to interact with the DOM very imperatively. We still have to kind of select elements, grab references, manually add event listeners. Very different than, say, Angular React, where we have kind of all the nice data binding features. So web components didn't add any of those type of higher level APIs. They want to stay kind of neutral, unopinionated. That way you can just kind of pick the web component authoring tool of your choice, and it will compile down to some version of code like this. So here we select on our root. So this .root, that's our shadow DOM chunk in our element. We select the div, and then I set the style to be display none. So we're going to hide that content by default. Then I select my button element, and I add my event listener. So on click, I'll toggle the show, and then toggle the CSS display property based on show. So if it's truthy, we'll display block. If it's falsely, we'll display none. So kind of just a little bit of wiring up code. So if we go to content slot, we can see we have our button, and if we click it, our content is rendered. And this content, hello from web component, comes from our index file. So we can see there's our dynamic content in between our tags, and the browser is going to take this element and insert it wherever we define that slot element. If we look at the DOM in the DevTools, we'll see it looks a little bit different than you may expect. We can see our button, our div, our slot element, but notice the content is not actually in the slot itself. It's in the same location where you placed it in between the X dropdown tags. This is kind of like a content projection. It's just taking the content and kind of projecting it to that location. So it's just kind of something to be aware of when you're debugging and you can't see where the content's actually being located. With the slot API, I won't really have time to go over this. Slot API is similar to ng content. You can have multiple slots. You can have named slots. So if you want to have multiple dynamic insertion points, that's possible as well. So the next step introduces events for web components. So with Angular, using events between components is a really common way to communicate. And we would typically do that with an output decorator and the event emitter. Web components work very similar. So in this example, we're going to add a custom event to our dropdown. That way we can listen to the dropdown and know when it's been opened or closed. So kind of our high-level use case, you would want to know if the dropdown's been opened, so you could load in maybe some additional dynamic content into that dropdown. So in our index file, we can select the reference to our dropdown. And then when you create a custom event on a web component, it works just like any other DOM event. So you can just create an event listener, listen to the event, and then log that event out or do whatever you need with the event. And you can name the event anything you want. It's just a string value. So for our event, we called it show. So going to the component, most of the code, same as before, same template. Difference is on the click. We kind of refactored it and moved the toggle logic to a method on the class, this toggle method. Same logic as before, toggling the styles. But then on line 27 is where we're defining our custom event. So we say this.dispatch event. We get this dispatch event method from inheriting the HTML element. So we dispatch an event and we create a new custom event. And this custom event takes two parameters, the name of the event, and then a options object. This options object has a few different things you can attach to it. The detail property is for any data that you want to pass back to your event. So if we're thinking in kind of Angular world, when you do event emitter.emit and then whatever value you pass in, this detail would be the equivalent. So we're going to pass back a Boolean to any event listener to tell if the dropdown is showing or hiding. So really,
so custom event is part of HTML5, just like custom elements.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's just kind of built in. So it's another global.
I was going to say, where would you find this information if you weren't doing it, if you hadn't done it before and you didn't know? And then I was like, oh, your book. You just buy your book and then look it up anytime. So actually, because I was learning from your blog like forever, right? Before I even knew who you were or before I met you in person. So I really like it when you do tutorials. So I put a link in the chat to your book.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so custom event and custom elements.
Yeah, the custom event, other places you could find it is like the MDN docs. They have a pretty good section on custom elements. If you are using TypeScript, TypeScript does give you some nice like IntelliSense. So I think if you just like start typing custom event or event, it'll prompt you with a couple different options. And I think it's in that list. But yeah.
James says it was a jQuery thing.
Oh, custom event was, yeah.
Yeah. That's old school cool right there. jQuery.
So yeah, that's about it for custom events. It's really actually just that one line. It's a pretty small API. But once you define
detail
it,
attribute, are there any other attributes besides the detail attribute? The detail attribute is for passing something back out, but is that, are there more?
I believe there's a couple others. I don't remember them offhand. I'd have to go look them up. But once you log that object out with the detail, it gives you a little bit more than just the value. So if we go to the events example, go to console, when you trigger the event, it actually passes back a bunch of information about that particular component. And detail is just one of those properties on that object. I
love the console log, and I'm not ashamed to say it.
Yeah, I use it all the time, especially with RxJS. I use it everywhere.
So yeah, for people who are really used to Angular, we get used to emitting events, and we can just emit whatever we want, and what gets caught, what gets emitted up is actually just whatever object we want, a primitive, whatever. And it looks to me like we don't have the right to do that. We're bubbling up a custom event, and if we want to provide that payload, it has to go in detail. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. Yeah, and in a later step, when I show how to use this particular component in Angular, when you listen to the event, you'll actually have to do like event.detail to get the actual value, because it's going to pass back this entire object here. Okay, so the next step is properties. So kind of continuing on with the Angular theme. So we, in Angular and web components, we use events for the component to communicate to us, but we also can use custom properties to pass data down to a component. So in Angular components, we use the square property binding syntax to set data on a property of a component. So using input decorator. Same kind of functionality with web components, custom elements. So in our example, for our dropdown, we're going to create a custom property called title. And whenever you set title, it's going to change the content of the button. And in this example, we're going to show that you can set that property and then set it at a later point and trigger the component to re-render. So just showing the example here. See, we have custom title, and then our set timeout fires, we get new custom title. We're passing data down to the component.
That is very cool.
So this is kind of where, when I first started with web components, kind of like scrunched my nose. It's like, this is kind of verbose. This is going to be kind of verbose, low-level API. This is where some of the web component authoring tools I'll talk about in a little bit can help. But to create a custom property, you define a property on your class. And to get the behavior of triggering some kind of action whenever that property is set, I'm using a getter and a setter. So on my component, I have a title, get, and set. And then I have a private title that's going to hold on to the actual value. So if you read the property title from the component, you'll get the title. And then if you set the property, so doing like dropdown.title equals, whenever that occurs, the setter will get called, and we set the private value, and then we can set the button's inner text, which will trigger that button to re-render. So in our component, I have those getters and setters defined, and then in the constructor, I give the title an initial value and set the button's inner text for that initial render. So custom properties for web components is basically just defining properties on the element itself, whereas Angular, you would set the input decorator. So it's a little bit more wiring up than kind of a typical framework would have. but same behavior. We could just set properties and pass any data type down to that component. So here I'm passing a string. Because it's a JavaScript property, I can pass anything. I can pass an object or an array. Doesn't matter.
Can we clarify? James had a question in the chat. Is there ever a case? Well, it was a minute ago because there's a delay in the chat, but we were talking about passing the event. No, we were talking about event. So when you had the console log on that one, and you had the .detail, do you ever use any of the other attributes there besides detail? I was trying to, because he asked, like, after you had moved on, and I was trying to remember what I just saw in the console log.
Not super often personally, but there are use cases where that extra information is helpful. So,
That's
for
what
example,
I say too. Mostly, I want my data.
Yeah, like for example, if you were building maybe like a drag and drop style component, you would need to know the mouse cursor position, and that's in that data set. It actually tells you like when they clicked it, what was the mouse position. So like that would be a piece of information you would want.
That's such a good example.
I'm trying to think if there's any, if you want to know like what element was clicked at a global level, it gives you like a list of like the hierarchy of like every nested element all the way down to the one you clicked. I'm sure there's a lot more use cases, but most of the time, yeah, I only use the detail.
Me too.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting you. It's their fault.
No, it's fine. Ask as many questions as you want. Okay, so the next step is attributes. So in Angular, when you use that input decorator, it does two things. It allows you to set the custom property on your Angular component, and it also lets you set that property via an HTML attribute. So you can set an attribute just on the element without using the square braces. And web components, you can do the same thing. It's just kind of like before, it's more verbose. So here, instead of setting our title with JavaScript, so you can see we're not doing dropdown.title, just in the HTML, we're just setting a title attribute, and that's going to get passed to our button and render that out. So if we go to our attributes here, we can see hello from attribute. So we can use attributes to pass data in. Now, the thing with attributes is it's a little bit of a trade-off. Attributes are really handy because you don't have to write extra code. You don't have to add, like select the element and then set the property in JavaScript. You could just configure it with an attribute in the HTML, which is pretty convenient. The downside is with HTML attributes, the values are always strings, no matter what you put in there. If you were to try to put an object in here, it's just going to be a string with curly braces. So you're kind of restricted to your data types that you pass through attributes. And the same rule applies with Angular as well. So to add attribute support to your web component, on the component, you can implement a static method called observed attributes. And this is just part of the custom elements API. Now, what this observed attributes method does is it expects you to return a list of all the attributes you want to define on your custom component. The main reason for this is performance. Attributes can be updated quite often, especially if the component is being used in a framework or a large application. So you explicitly state which attributes you care about as a developer for your specific component. So here we're saying we're going to have a title attribute for our component. The rest of the code, same as before. We have our getter and setter to update the title property. But then down towards the bottom, we have this new lifecycle hook, attribute change callback. So this is another lifecycle hook that's built into the custom elements API. And if you come from Angular, this is going to look pretty familiar. It's going to look a lot like ng on changes. it works very similar. What attribute change callback does is anytime one of the attributes in your list that you defined above is updated, this method will get called and pass in 3 pieces of information. It's going to pass in the name of the attribute that changed. So ours would be title, the previous value, and the new value. And what that'll let you do is check which attribute changed and then do kind of efficient updates. So if, for our case, if the attribute is title and the old value is different than the new value, then go ahead and update the title property. And because our properties use getters and setters, when we set title, our button will get updated. So it's kind of a new lifecycle hook to implement this. And we can see that in the dev tools. If we go to the dev tools here and go to my title and update it to hello, we can see the button gets that update.
Yeah, that's pretty slick.
Yeah, so it's kind of cool to see, like, studying these APIs. It's really neat to see the correlations between Angular and some of the other frameworks. Like, all these components from all these different frameworks, they're all pretty much doing the same thing. Everyone's kind of agreed that components are a great idea, and everyone's doing the exact same thing. It's just slightly different syntax between all the different frameworks. So once you learn like components in one framework, it's pretty easy just to grab them from any other framework. And same with web components.
Yeah, it's really nice, these frameworks. I've met so many people, or, you know, I'm an Angular developer, but I meet a lot of React developers, and we have mashups sometimes with a React group here in Houston, and we have sometimes group events because there's so much overlay. And it's cool because there's so much overlap in what we do, you know. I mean, we're competitive, but it's a friendly kind of competition. But this applies to everything, and it's nice to see those things normalized.
Yeah.
The things that we have in common, that this is like something that everybody can use together. We could all be friends, you guys.
Yeah, what's really cool also is, like, with these new APIs, all these tools can start using these APIs. So instead of the framework having to figure out how do I watch an attribute for updates, the browser will just tell you now. So that means the framework can be smaller and faster. It doesn't have to do as much work. It's just built in.
So is your next talk at ngHouston going to be about our frameworkless future, just using web components?
So I actually kind of mentioned that in this talk. So maybe I could probably spin off another talk about that.
2 steps ahead of us.
I don't know about frameworkless. Maybe smaller frameworks.
Yeah.
You can be the trendsetter. You could just come on every week with the state of JavaScript, the state of TypeScript and JavaScript.
I don't know about trendsetter. It might be more like follow me off the edge of the cliff because I went the wrong way.
At least we're all going together.
Okay, let's see. Next step. Okay, so next up, Shadow DOM. This is the one that kind of shows off the CSS encapsulation functionality. So working example here, I've got this paragraph. Actually, I think it might be a div tag. Yeah, div tag here, and it has a global style, color red and a little bit of margin. So with just typical CSS, I'm just defining this in the head. This would apply to every div in my application. Now, if you're using Shadow DOM, though, when you have a Shadow DOM instance,
it's just crazy talk.
Yeah.
Global styles. What are you doing? You nut?
Yeah. So Angular gives you this for free in the framework, but they have a couple different modes. They by default have an emulated mode. That way, it works in browsers that don't support Shadow DOM. Has slightly different behavior, but same concept. You can actually turn on Shadow DOM in Angular in your component. You can change the encapsulation mode. So if you want to use the native mechanism. But we can see here in our dropdown here, I have a div that has some styles as well, but the global red styles aren't being applied. It's protected because it's got its own shadow root. And the shadow DOM with CSS works both ways. So the global styles can't override child components, and then any styles defined in that child component can't override parent or global styles. So for our dropdown, we defined a little bit of padding and border, and that particular style is not being applied to the global div element. So to implement that kind of functionality, it's actually really easy. If you're just using vanilla web components, you just simply define a style tag in your template, and it'll just automatically encapsulate that into your template for you. So you don't have to add any additional APIs. And then in the index file here, we can see there's the global style being applied.
But if you still want to import a bunch of libraries just for fun, you can do that. Okay.
Yeah, and some of the web component tools that are out there let you write your CSS in a separate file, or you can write your CSS in Sass or less, and then it'll compile it and inject it into your components template. That way you don't have to write your CSS like in a string of HTML in your JavaScript. You can actually have it as a separate file. Just takes a little bit more tooling. What the tools that do that?
Yeah.
There's several tools. So like Angular Elements kind of sort of does that. Stencil.js, which is a tool I'll mention later, does that. Polymer from the Chrome team is another web component authoring tool. Does something similar to that as well. So pretty much all the web component tools have some variation of that. It's just if you're using vanilla JavaScript, like no help whatsoever, you're kind of stuck with this style right here, like where you just put the style tag in your template.
Gotcha.
Now there is an extension, I believe, in VS Code that will try to recognize HTML in a template string in JavaScript, and it will do some syntax highlighting. That way it's not, one orange blob. It'll give you like nice colorization. Pretty sure there's an extension for that. So it'll make it a little bit nicer to use. Now with the shadow DOM, because it's got that two-way encapsulation, things are kind of blocked both ways. So we run into this issue of, well, I really want to use your Dropdown component, but I think it's ugly and I want to change the way it looks. Well, with shadow DOM, you can't really easily change those styles. So that kind of gets us to our last API, the CSS Custom Properties API. Now, what this API will allow us to do is kind of define a public API or a theming API for other developers to be able to tweak the styles of our component. So in this example, we have the same component, just has a gray border, a little bit of padding. But in our styles, we're using the new CSS Custom Properties. So they're very similar to like Sass or less variables, but quite a bit more powerful. You can do a lot more with them. And using this API, we can define these custom properties on our component, and then any consumer of this component can actually tweak and adjust those properties. So on this dropdown here, I use a CSS selector, the host selector, and the host selector is basically saying select the host element or my parent element. So that's going to be our X dropdown tag. So select that element and then define a custom property named border color, and its value is just color CCC. Now later in our styles, we can use that color as a variable. So in our border, we can say var border color. So it's using it as a dynamic variable. And we could use that over and over again, so it reduces duplication in our component. But this is also the mechanism that lets us customize it as a consumer of the component. So in my index file, in my global styles, I can select my dropdown and then just change that property. So I'm going to change it to red. Now in my rendered output, my border is now red. It's because I've exposed that particular variable as a property for other developers to be able to tweak. So that's kind of a way to be able to adjust the theme of your web components. And actually, kind of reference to Angular, CSS Custom Properties you can use in Angular components as well. I just started using that on a project. It's actually been really nice.
This is awesome.
Okay, so that's actually it for that part of the code demo. So that's kind of all the basic APIs to get kind of a minimal web component going. Each one of those APIs is quite large. You could go real deep into each one of those, but those are kind of just the high level, kind of just enough to be able to build something out. Now, all those APIs, like I mentioned before, are vanilla JavaScript APIs. You don't really have any help. Like with our dropdown, we had to select elements and add our event listeners. But there's a lot of tools out there that let you use kind of the nice framework level APIs, and they just compile down to vanilla web components. So Angular has this, the Angular Elements API that they're working on. So you could write an Angular component. You can use all the fancy Angular APIs, and when it compiles out, it just spits out a web component. So now you can take your Angular component and drop it into your Vue application or React. Polymer's been around for quite a while. That's by the Chrome team. They have an API for building out web components. The one that I think is really cool that just came out is Stencil.js. This one is built by Ionic. They use it for their Ionic UI kit. And Stencil—
Did Mike pay you to say that?
No, I swear he didn't. No, I think it's really cool though. If you come from Angular or React, Stencil is kind of this cool hybrid in the middle because it uses TypeScript and decorators that look a lot like Angular, and then its templates are JSX templates, so very similar to React. So it's like if you like a little bit of Angular and React, you can kind of meet in the middle with Stencil. So, and then Stencil also probably has some of the best performance characteristics that I've seen out of all the authoring tools. And then Vue, I don't have much experience with this, but I did a little research. In the Vue ecosystem, they have the Vue component wrapper. So you can write Vue.js components, and then it wraps it in a custom element API. That way you can use your Vue components as web components in other apps. So a lot of the frameworks out there are all kind of working on getting this web component support in both ways, being able to create web components using their APIs and also being able to consume web components with their APIs. Okay, so I've got one more demo, and this demo actually takes our dropdown component that we just went through and shows how you integrate it into an Angular CLI project and a Vue.js project, just to prove that I'm not lying and crazy, that you can actually use these components in several frameworks.
This doesn't prove that you're crazy, Cory.
I've actually explained this to some devs I know, and they're like, there's no way it works in multiple frameworks. Like, that's just crazy talk.
What the hell you say? I'll believe it when I see it.
Okay, so I've got a little Angular CLI project here. We'll get that up and running. While that's going, we'll show the code. It's actually pretty simple. So let's see. No, my app module. So I published the dropdown component, the exact same dropdown that we just went through, to NPM under the package Web Component Essentials. So to use this component in Angular, I just did a npm install Web Component Essentials. That's just the name of the package for that particular component. I import that component. You can actually import this pretty much anywhere. You just want to make sure you import it wherever you use it. So you can import it in your app module, or you could import it in main, or whatever components are actually using the dropdown. I think typically I'll import my web components from the app module.
So this web component.
Web Component Essentials sounds a little bit familiar. Like that might be a good name for a book title or something.
Yeah, maybe.
So
Is this just for demos or teaching, or is
Yeah.
this actually something that we can, like, we have your permission to use this in our projects?
If you want to use it, it's mostly for teaching demos. This is where I publish like example web components.
I got you.
Are
So
these the
they're
same examples from the book?
yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
they might change.
So we should just buy the book.
Well, yeah.
Sure.
And they might change as you tweak the book and get it ready for publication.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just kind of my package name I went with, just to throw in a bunch of web component examples. That way I can pull them into other examples. So you can publish your components under any NPM package. But once you publish it, you can import it into your Angular app. And then you have to do one extra step. The Angular compiler does this advanced checking in your templates to look for any unknown element tags. That way it catches things like typos. So like you write out your component in your template and you make a typo, Angular will check to make sure like that component definition exists. Because of that, you have to add this custom element schema to your application module. And that just basically tells Angular, hey, we're going to have some tags that you don't know about. They're going to be custom elements that are not registered to Angular. And it kind of just laxes the rules. That way you can use your web components.
Yeah, and Angular developers might recognize that from error messages. If you forget to, if you write a component and start using it in a parent component, but forget to register it in a module, you'll get an error message that says maybe you're using a web component, or maybe you forgot to put it in an app module, and it will specify this as one of the options for you.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, if
you might not like those error messages unless you graduated from AngularJS, and then you're so grateful to have them.
Oh yeah.
It's like, I love these error messages. They tell me exactly what's wrong and how to fix it. We're spoiled these days.
Yep. Like back in my day.
Yeah.
So once you have it imported and you add that extra option there, you can just start using the component in your templates. So here I have the same Dropdown component. And because web components use properties and events just like Angular components, I can just use the Angular syntax. So on my component TypeScript, I have a property, my title, and I have a method called toggle. And in my template, I set the property. I set the title property of my dropdown to my title, and I listen to the show event, which can call my toggle method, and I can capture that event value, just like any other Angular component. So now I'll catch the event, and I set the property of open. If I go to my running example here, I have my Angular application, and I click the button. Everything opens. We can see it's listening to the event. It's updating the template. And I'm getting the event out of the log as well. So this was the part that I really liked about web components and how Angular designed its templating syntax. It definitely makes it very clear why they went with this syntax, because the syntax is just perfect for the web components API. Okay, so then the last step is a view example. And in Vue.js, it's a little bit more simple than Angular to start using your component. You just import the package, and you don't have to do any extra configuration with like telling it like, hey, I'm using web components. You just import it and then start using it. So for Vue apps, they do single file components. So a .vue file, which contains your template and your logic and your styles. So here I have a template. It looks very similar to Angular. So we have that kind of show expression. And they have a similar kind of syntax to Angular as well. So if I want to bind to the title property, instead of square braces, I use this shorthand colon. And if I want to listen to the show event, instead of parentheses, I use the @ symbol. And on my component, my view component, I define the data or the properties of my component. So my title is what's going to get passed to my dropdown, and then the methods for my component. So I have a log method, very similar to my Angular component. So if I go to view application and click my button, we can see exact same functionality, same web component being used. So I thought that was really cool when I first started learning web components, is this idea of being able to write a component once and then use it pretty much anywhere I want. That's a really nice feature. So yeah, mentioning in my book, so I am working on this actively right now. I just released a chapter this week on how to integrate with Angular and Vue. And then I'm hoping in the next 2 weeks, I'll have another one on Stencil.js. So you can find out more at the webcomponentessentials.com. I have a new newsletter I'm starting on that website. So I'm going to be posting like new blog posts related to web components. So if you want to get notified about that new content, you can subscribe there. That's all I have. That's everything. Thanks. Any questions?
Thank you. I think we jumped in with questions along the way. I don't think we saved them for the end.
Oops,
but oh wow,
stopping.
Inceptions. Hold
Yeah,
on,
my
you
screen
have to turn
share
off
is
your
not
screen
stopping.
share.
Did it stop?
It did stop. Yes.
There we go. Okay.
So everyone in the chat is just saying thank you and you're awesome. And shut up and take my money. So when is the stencil book coming out?
Stencil chapter probably. If I get time, maybe if I cram, end of next week. More than likely, probably 2 weeks out, because I just started it a couple days ago.
Faster, Cory, faster. We have work to do. We need your help.
Yeah. So
this
the book,
awesome.
the book progress so far basically covers everything I talked about, just in a little bit more detail. And I just added the Angular Vue examples, and then stencils next. And I'll also be adding Polymer. And I also just added a chapter last week as well on lit HTML, which is another Polymer feature. So if you just want to see like the many different ways you can build a web component, I'm going to try to add as many as I can.
Did you know all those frameworks ahead of time, or did you learn them specifically for the book?
Mostly specific for the book in a way. Like web components, where I work currently, web components potentially could solve a lot of problems we're having, like with wanting to share certain components across different applications and use cases. So I kind of just wanted to deep dive into web components and like see what the state was, like how can we use those now? Like, is that a thing still? And I kind of just picked it up as I went along. So like, I don't have much experience with Vue.js at all. Like I know just enough to work a little bit with a demo app. Same with Stencil. I'm just kind of trying to learn as I go.
Well, you're awesome. And we are very happy to be able to learn along with you. I always, like I said, I knew your blog. The first time I met you, I was like, I know who you are because I've been reading your blog for a long time. I was a big fan because you just have a very simple way of like breaking things down. It's, you know, I'm trying to figure out something. I want to go to a blog post that some get complicated and there's like this, you know, big example that's, you know, 57 lines of code and you just break things down into one specific piece and just make it super simple. And I love that about you. So you're a very good teacher. Don't let it go to your head though. Okay, well that is, so that's it for tonight. And Cory, you're always welcome to come back anytime. And Lance, you too. You guys are always welcome on ngHouston. We love to have you. And Cory, thank you so much for coming and teaching us really cool stuff. And one more time, it's webcomponentessentials.com. is your new book, and it's awesome. And I already bought it. So.
Me too.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for tonight. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye.